Sole sign worth 258.
On September the 11th, 2001, a group of terrorists committed an act of what they called holy war. What they did would dominate the beginning of the 21st century. And the Western world found it both horrific and inexplicable. But the drift towards this extreme kind of holy war had been taking place for over 2 decades. It's a frightening story, with its origins in the war of terror which has dominated all others. And yet it's a story whose roots can be traced in another act of terror over 30 years ago, which also used airliners, but with a different motive and in a very different way. On the 6th of September 1970, teams from a little-known Marxist resistance group, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, set out to hijack simultaneously 4 Western passenger aircraft. They planned to direct them to here, an expanse of desert in Jordan known as Dawson's Field, once a World War II landing strip for fighter planes. This was going to be the world's first media terrorist event. Its aim was to confront the West with the plight of Palestinians in the Middle East, who'd been displaced by the Jewish state of Israel.
We were fighting for a just cause. A blunt occupation by force to our land, to our people, and the whole world did not pay attention. We thought of ways and means of forcing any average European or American to say, why are they doing this?
One of the planes, a Pan Am Boeing 747, was too big to land at Dawson's Field and put down at Cairo instead. 2 of them made it safely to their intended theatre.
It was, for me, even very thrilling experience to see those planes landing in the desert.
We've just driven for an hour across the open desert to this incredibly dangerous and dramatic situation in which the people in these 2 aircraft find themselves.
As the Jordanian army encircled the aircraft, the Western television audience was gripped by a real-life drama in which 306 passengers were held hostage in the baking sun by the PFLP. But the operation on plane number 4, their main prize, an El Al flight from Amsterdam, was going awry. On board, the PFLP's most notorious hijacker, Leila Khaled, was at the pilot's door with a grenade in each hand.
Somebody was looking through this secret eye, and I showed him that I have opened hand grenades. Then I threatened, just because there was shouting and crying of the passengers, because there was shooting in the plane. And I said, if you don't open, I'll blow up the plane.
El Al security officers recognized Khaled as the woman who had hijacked one of their planes the year before and grabbed her.
2 came from behind and caught me, and they caught me by the hands. I thought that the plane exploded. Then I opened my eyes, saw people over me just kicking.
Khaled's armed accomplice was also quickly overpowered.
A man with a pistol came and shot 4 bullets. Then another one with a bottle and just crashed it over his head.
Soon after the plane arrived at Heathrow Airport, Khaled's accomplice died from injuries received during the struggle. But the British still had one PFLP terrorist in custody. Back at Dawson's Field, under the desert sun, the drama of the hijacked passengers was being orchestrated by the PFLP spokesman, Bassam Abu Sharif.
We demand that everybody should be seated, including our guests.
We were frustrated. We wanted the world to look into the situation to see what kind of injustices are inflicted on our people.
Excuse me, we wanted the captain and the stewardess to tell us about the sanitary conditions on the TWA plane, how things are.
Would you like to smell?
Yes,
What do you think?
yes.
They don't have water. What do you mean asking such a question?
Recognizing they could not risk alienating world opinion, they allowed 127 women and children to be taken to Amman. These hostages were safe. But less than 2 years later, the PFLP would organize a massacre of 26 innocent civilians at Tel Aviv airport. At Dawson's Field, it quickly became clear just who had been left sweltering in the aircraft: all the Jewish passengers.
Why are you keeping the Jewish women and children hostage?
They are not kept because they are Jewish. They are kept just for interrogation for the reason I mentioned, the dual citizenship. The United States of America, the imperialist world force, helps Israel in attacking us.
In London, the thwarted PFLP hijacker Leila Khaled was behind bars. As pro-Zionist campaigners took to the streets to keep her there, a fifth plane now entered the drama.
When I was arrested in Britain, a Palestinian chap in Dubai thought of doing something to release me. So he went to a BOAC coming from Bombay and he hijacked it.
The fifth plane, a British VC-10, put down at Dawson's Field with 104 passengers on board. A British journalist acting as go-between conveyed the PFLP's demands for the release of Palestinian prisoners from jails throughout the world. The lives of over 400 passengers now hung in the balance.
The PFLP warns that any stupid intervention to free the hostages will only endanger their lives.
I was briefed by the leadership, and I got answers from the leadership on the offers of the envoys. So it is true. I mean, at that time, there was nobody running the show but me.
Our demands and conditions are very clear, and we will not go back on them.
British passengers had become valuable currency in the bid to secure Leila Khaled's release.
The release of Comrade Leila Khaled in exchange for the British hostages.
In return for the lives of the hostages, the British Prime Minister Edward Heath and his fellow Western heads of state secretly agreed to release Palestinian guerrillas held in jails in Europe, including Leila Khaled. 5 days after the hijack began, the remaining hostages were freed unharmed. But as terrorism lost its power to shock, innocents caught up in future PFLP operations would not be so lucky. With the hostages safe, the PFLP executed a final, defiant gesture to the world. In destroying the 3 empty aircraft, they created an iconic symbol of modern terrorism.
Success of Dawson Fields lay in the exposure that it got on what was then becoming understood as the mass media. And the lack of casualties made it immensely attractive. And what then became evident was that you could grab hold of Western opinion. You could spellbind the world for some days.
How about the women and kids? Are they all right?
They are fine. Everyone was very well treated. Yes.
31 years later, on September the 11th, 2001, another terrorist spectacular using airliners would be staged, this time with deliberate and horrific loss of life. In the intervening years, a potent new ingredient had entered the terrorist equation: religion. In the middle of Jerusalem is a place so deeply sacred to both Muslims and Jews that some are prepared to die for it. To religious Jews, the site beyond this wall is the Temple Mount, where the third temple must be built to herald the coming of their Messiah. Yet they believe it has been desecrated by a Muslim shrine, the Dome of the Rock, built to cover the spot from which Muslims believe Muhammad ascended to heaven.
It is very, very painful that the most holy place of the Jewish nation, the place that we have to be so close, almost face to face with our God, we are thrown out so brutally.
The problem with the Zionist mentality is that it doesn't grasp the fact that others have holy places. Others have places of worship. They can't be touched or desecrated.
I cannot sit quiet in my home if the Temple Mount is closed. So I was a part of a group that planned to blow up the Dome of the Rock.
In early 1980, this group of religious Jews conspired to rid the Temple Mount of Islamic contamination once and for all. Under cover of night, Yehuda Etzion would lead a specially trained unit of Jewish activists in the clandestine operation. Another conspirator was Dan Be'eri.
Some people would get inside the mount with packs of explosives and place them against the column and destroy it. The very effectiveness of this act would be its cleanness. It wasn't about having Arab blood shed. It was about having this dome, which is a symbol of sovereignty of Islam over this place, blown apart, in order to make clear that this place is and is only the Temple Mount.
For their attack on the dome, Etzion's group needed the blessing of a rabbi. But even their own rabbi, Zvi Yehuda Kook, refused to countenance such a momentous attack. Such was the plotters' religious fervour that without this blessing, they were forced to leave intact the building they termed the Abomination. But then, in May 1980, the atmosphere changed dramatically. A group of American religious students was subjected to a lethal and unprovoked Palestinian attack.
We were all unarmed, and we were attacked by machine gun fire and hand grenades. And we never even got to entering the building.
6 of the students were killed outright, and several others were badly wounded. Etzion resolved to carry out a revenge attack, and this time his plan was endorsed by his rabbis. Etzion and his team targeted 5 prominent Palestinians, among them 2 elected mayors.
I participated in the preparing of the bombs, and I trained the people, explain them exactly what to do and how to do, where exactly everybody lives and where exactly his car and how to build it. This was my part.
Small bombs, specifically designed to maim their victims, were placed in the car engines of the Palestinian leaders.
The bomb exploded, and I feel that it's a very dangerous situation because I feel that my body fell down empty.
2 of the 5 Palestinians were crippled for life.
He tried to kill an elected mayor who have a civilian responsibility. He did not kill someone who fight, who carry arms, who fight against. He tried to kill someone when he went to his civilian duty. For that, I believe that he is a criminal and he used a crime.
Bassam Shaka and the other mayors try to cut not only our legs, they try to take our souls. So if it was finished by their legs, it is fair.
In 1984, Etzion's team was finally rounded up and tried for its crimes. The then Israeli government was determined to set an example to the Palestinian leadership by cracking down on terror. The Jews remained locked out of the Temple Mount and continued to worship at the foot of the Wailing Wall, their messianic expectations for the time being on hold. But the spiral of religiously inspired terror was only just beginning. In 1993, Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and PLO chairman Yasser Arafat shook hands on a deal known as the Oslo Accord. Under the agreement, the Jews' biblical heartland on the West Bank would ultimately revert to Palestinian control. For many Jews, it was a huge disappointment.
I believe that Judea and Samaria is my ancestral land. It's not a question of belief. That's where the word Jew comes from. That's where for thousands of years Jews lived. That's where our country and our people was formed. Our religion and our nationhood was forged. So that's not a question of particular belief. It's a question of historical fact. But it doesn't entitle me in any way, as I don't think the whole overwhelming majority of the settler community believes, entitles them to, and they don't believe it, that it entitles us to shed all morality and to butcher the innocent.
But for some extreme religious Jews, butchering the innocent seemed the only answer. The ancient town of Hebron became the flashpoint, where despite being surrounded by 25,000 Palestinians, 400 religious Jews had settled to be near the 3,000-year-old burial site of Abraham, Sarah, and Isaac. Within this heavily guarded building, there are prayer halls for both Jews and Muslims. To the Muslims, it is the Al Ibrahimi Mosque. To the Jews, it is the Cave of the Patriarchs.
It's not a mosque. It belongs to Jews. The Arabs everywhere, every place that we see as a holy place to us, they come and they build mosques.
This is the Jewish festival of Purim. Religious Jews retell the biblical story of how their ancestors rose up against their enemies throughout the ancient Persian Empire. And it was on this religious site, and on the day of Purim in 1994, that a Jewish settler called Baruch Goldstein struck. Until that day, he had seemed a man of healing, tending both Jew and Palestinian alike.
He was a very silent person. I didn't hear him even once shouting on someone. He was gentle, very gentle.
Today, Baruch Goldstein is a symbol of defiance in these Jews' holy war.
He saved us. Hebron is the heart of the world, and our ancestors, our parents, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, are buried in Hebron. Here begins the kingdom of David. Here will come the great redemption of the world, righteousness, love for fellow man, happiness. It all starts in Hebron, and Baruch Goldstein saved Hebron.
Baruch Goldstein had become increasingly agitated as tensions heightened in Hebron following the Oslo Accord. As Palestinians began to challenge the authority of the Israeli military in the West Bank, there followed a series of murders of Jewish settlers, one of which Goldstein could not forgive.
I know that it was a personal revenge on for the assassination of his personal friend Mordechai Lapid and his son Shalom Lapid, who was my pupil during 5 years, and he was a genius. This youth, really, and very mild and gentle people, and they were assassinated near Hebron. And from the time of this assassination, he wasn't the same man.
On the morning of February the 25th, 1994, taxi driver Marwan Nezmi followed the call to prayer from the Al Ibrahimi Mosque. He left his wife and 6 children at home in bed.
On Friday morning, we were up early and my daughter said to me, "Let's go and pray in the mosque, Mum." So I got dressed quickly and we went. I took my 6-year-old daughter and went for prayer. I also took my other 3 children, the 2 boys and the girl. We entered the women's section of the mosque. And as we started praying, the shooting began.
Goldstein had quietly entered a side door of the mosque, wearing his Israeli army uniform. He had pulled out an assault rifle hidden in his coat and began firing indiscriminately into the crowd of men and boys kneeling in prayer.
I saw the man who sat behind me killed and his head open, and another man beside me were killed. When we escaped, I saw the Israeli soldiers shooting fire at me, and I touched something in my head here. I put my hand to see what that. I see blood in my hand.
30 men and boys were killed. Goldstein was overpowered by the angry survivors and beaten to death. But to the settler community in Hebron, he lives on as a hero.
Barak Goldstein wine, commemoration of Purim, year 5764, that is 1994. A righteous man is happy when he sees his enemies die. Bush is happy when he sees bin Laden hanging from a tree. And then all the evil people and the terrorists will go out of this world, and then all the people in the world, along with the Jews, will be able to live lives of peace without fear of terrorism. To life.
My husband always said he wanted to die a martyr. Every time he prayed, he asked God to make him a martyr.
After months of skirmishing, the West Bank erupted in terrible violence. Hamas now had the perfect pretext to escalate their holy war against the Jews. For the first time, they adopted the tactic already used to devastating effect by their Muslim brothers, Hezbollah, in Lebanon.
You know that after that massacre of Goldie Stein, Hamas started really the waves of martyred bombers and to push Israelis to stop their policy of killing civilians.
From the beginning, Hamas suicide bombers were inspired and blessed by the group's spiritual leader, Sheikh Ahmad Yassin.
He who is prepared to sacrifice himself with his blood will retake the Holy Land. The homeland does not come on a silver platter. The enemy won't give us our land back for nothing. Kingdoms aren't built by victims. You want to get the homeland without any blood, without any martyrs, without sacrifices?
In April 1994, 40 days after Goldstein's massacre, Yassin gave his blessing to the first ever martyr operation on Israeli soil. In the West Bank town of Afula, a Hamas suicide bomber detonated himself near a bus full of Israeli schoolchildren. 8 children were killed, 44 were injured. Eyewitnesses described the children as burning like torches.
We are not something which is abnormal, but it's a normal thing. Every religious one believes that when he defending his people, defending his issue, defending his land, so when he sacrificed for others, then he will be blessed from his God.
In September 2000, Israel's then opposition leader Ariel Sharon staged a walkabout to reassert Jewish claims to the Temple Mount. To the Palestinians, it was a hugely provocative act. It sparked a wave of riots, which escalated into the Second Palestinian Uprising, or Intifada. Now, the glory of a martyr's death as a suicide bomber spread from the extremes of Hamas right into the main military wing of Yasser Arafat's PLO. These are the Palestinian nationalist suicide squads, the Al-Aqsa Brigades.
As Palestinians, we are unarmed. We have nothing to resist the tanks, the fighter jets, and the military hardware of the Israelis. The only means available to us to defend ourselves is for people to sacrifice themselves so our people can live.
In January 2002, the Al-Aqsa Brigades gave a new twist to the martyr strategy by carrying out the first female suicide bomber operation. The bomber was a university graduate, Wafa Idris, a volunteer for the Palestinian Red Crescent Medical Unit, and the sister of a wanted PLO activist.
On the day it happened, things were normal at home. She left in the morning to go to work at the Palestinian Red Crescent, and there was no change in her daily life. None of us in the house expected she might do a martyrdom operation. It was just another day.
At around 3:30 that afternoon, Wafa detonated herself in one of Jerusalem's main shopping streets. She killed 1 Israeli and injured 5 more. Like Baruch Goldstein, Wafa had witnessed such horrors tending the victims of the struggle that she had been left bitter and traumatized.
Every day when she came back home, she used to talk about the day's events, such as a young man had his skull blown off today, one had his gut sticking out, or someone had his foot blown off. She used to feel bitter, especially because of her work being exposed to those things.
Over 2 decades, the war in the West Bank had been given a violent new intensity by religious fervor. But it wasn't contained there. Over that same period, the fervor had been spreading in the Islamic world beyond. Every Friday at the ancient Al-Ashar Mosque in Cairo, the faithful hear sermons against Jews and their treatment of the Palestinians. The criticism is not reserved for the Jews alone, but is also aimed at America and the West. On leaving the service, the worshippers mingle with demonstrators, protesting against the twin enemies of the Islamic world, Israel and America.
You know what they're protesting about America and behind America.
You know, Israel, their policy is not much fair.
We accepted Israel in our area, but they want to push us out. How come?
The west side, you know, with some things like this. And you must know, Sharon is murder. You must know Sharon is murder. America is evil. كله تردوا معايا، كله يردوا معايا، كله يردوا معايا بالانجليزي. America is evil. ردوا معايا. America is evil. America is evil. America شيطان. America is evil.
The people who died on September the 11th, 2001, were believed by the West to have been the victims of one man, Osama bin Laden. In fact, the attack was devised by his spiritual mentor, a fanatical Egyptian who has fomented religious violence for 2 decades, Ayman Zawahiri.
Ayman
Zawahiri is Osama bin Laden's brain. He is the pivot of everything around bin Laden. With all my respect for bin Laden, Ayman is the brain. He is the planner. Ayman is the one who convinced bin Laden about the very idea of jihad. Before his encounter with Ayman Zawahiri, Osama bin Laden was an ordinary, rich, young Saudi man.
Long before he'd met bin Laden, Zawahiri had been plotting holy war against the West and its client rulers in the Middle East. He had grown up under Egyptian leaders who he believed were enslaved by the political and moral ideals of the West. Determined to overthrow them, he recruited young Muslims into a new revolutionary religious group.
I was looking for an identity that is away from the East and away from the West, and I found this vocation in Islam. Why don't we think about establishing our relations with God, with a reconciliation with Allah?
The group was called Al-Jihad, and it was dedicated to defeating the Western secular values embodied by Egyptian President Anwar Sadat. On the 6th of October 1981, it seized its chance to strike. Gunmen from the Al-Jihad group leapt from one of the military vehicles. Their leader, Khalid Islambouli, shouted, "I have killed the Pharaoh, and I do not fear death." Sadat had been the architect of his own bloody demise. In the early 1970s, he had released thousands of Muslim activists from the prisons into which they'd been thrown by his predecessor, Gamal Abdel Nasser. He did so in the hope they would break the influence of leftist and Marxist groups in the universities.
The government under Sadat is responsible that they gave them all chances to exist. They financed them, they helped them, they organized them. They gave them all the facilities to stand against the leftist groups in the university. Okay, but if you have poisoned snakes at home, you should suffer. And it happened.
I was one of the founders of the Islamic group in Egypt at the university. We managed to earn the students' trust and confidence peacefully, without violence. Ordinary people attended our mosques, our schools and hospitals peacefully.
But beneath the surface of this peaceful Islamization, ideas of religious revolution were being spread by Zawahiri and his supporters.
Dr. Ayman Zawahiri started to implement these ideas in small groups of 10 to 15 people. What became known as the Al-Jihad organizations always acted in small groups and in total secrecy. They don't believe in the efficiency of anything but direct military action. They recruit specially for direct military operations. They train their new recruits both intellectually and militarily. They address all their needs and manipulate their heart and soul.
Having released the Muslim radicals, Sadat then enraged them in 1979 by making peace with their sworn enemy, Israel, in a deal known as the Camp David Agreement. To make matters worse, it was the Great Satan, America, which had brought Sadat to the Star of David.
Sadat was killed because he signed the Camp David Agreement. He humiliated the prestigious religious Muslim scholars. He joked about the veil and Islamic Sharia laws. I personally believe that the decision to assassinate Sadat was necessary.
We believed in our religion, both as an ideology and practice, and hence we tried our best to establish this Islamic State and Islamic society.
Ayman Zawahiri was one of 2,500 Islamic militants detained for the conspiracy to murder Sadat. They were held for 3 years whilst the authorities tried to prove the case against them. During their imprisonment, Zawahiri and his followers were subjected to terrible torture, which served only to strengthen their religious fervour.
I still have scars all over my body from torture. I spent 9 months at the prison of El-Kala in solitary confinement and was subjected to a great deal of torture. During winter, they used to strip us and hose us with freezing water. I received electric shocks to sensitive parts of my body. I was beaten about the head.
On their release, Islamic militant leaders fled Egypt to join the jihad in Afghanistan against the Soviets. From there, they began to plot their all-out attack on the West. But before tackling the Great Satan, Zawahiri devised a final direct strike at the heart of Egypt's infidel regime, an operation in which the hunger to kill was to foreshadow the attack on America. In Egypt, tourism is the mainstay of the economy. A predominantly Islamic country, its unique collection of ancient monuments attracts hundreds of thousands of visitors every year. Now, the monuments are heavily guarded by both soldiers and the antiquities police. It is the legacy of the country's worst terrorist attack. On November the 17th, 1997, 6 Islamic militants descended from the hills to the 3,500-year-old temple of Queen Hatshepsut in Luxor.
When they first arrived, I said casually to them, "Tickets, please." He told me the guy behind me has got the tickets. They went off to the right. Then the other 2 came. I said, "Tickets, please." They pulled their weapons out straight away and started shooting at me. I was hit by 7 bullets in my head, my arm, my finger, my stomach, and my leg.
The 6 armed men now went after the defenseless tourists milling around the temple.
They have automatic rifles, automatic weapon, and they start shooting instantly to the tourists and the Egyptians alike, without any differentiation. There are 6 people, 3 this side, 3 this side, and get rid of the Egyptian and tourists. It was blood everywhere. It was blood. They lose their life for nothing. For nothing. You know, you come as a tourist, you want to enjoy your vacation, and suddenly you are in the middle of a trap.
An Egyptian guide and a group of 14 Swiss tourists were gunned down where they stood.
These people, they came to hurt as much as possible. So they went to the Hathor Chapel And goddess Hathor is the goddess of love, music, and pleasure, also to liquidate all of them. And the guardian, he was shot in this area.
In the Temple of Love, Music and Leisure, 10 Japanese tourists, 6 Swiss, and an Egyptian guard were killed. On the other side of the temple, at the shrine of Anubis, god of the underworld, there was more slaughter.
They start shooting haphazardly anyone moving in front of them, whether he is Egyptian or a foreigner.
A British family of 4 was murdered, along with another 15 Swiss tourists. The terrorists' appetite for death had no limits. They set out to hijack a bus to take them to another crowded tourist site.
Suddenly, 6 men were running towards me, shooting at my bus. One of them pointed a gun at the back of my head and shouted at me to open the door and to get going to the Valley of the Kings. As I was turning round, I said to myself, well, if they were locals, they would have gone up past the monastery in the valley up that hill. I was thinking it through, you know. So I thought I'd take them along the hospital road to see if they knew the area or not.
It quickly became apparent that the terrorists were not familiar with the area, and Nahas courageously steered them away from other tourist sites. Impatient to spill more blood, the trigger-happy terrorists took pot shots at other buses and tourists along the way.
Of course, when they realized I was trying to get them lost, they broke my shoulder. They were beating on my shoulder.
As the tourists in Luxor looked on, Nahas drove further and further into the hills, heading for a roadblock. But before he could reach it, 5 of the terrorists leapt from the bus, telling their remaining comrade to stay behind and kill the driver.
So I said to the one guarding me, "They're calling you." He said to me, "Nobody's calling me." But then they said to him, "Come on, come on." And he had one eye on me and one on the other 5. So I put the bus in gear, closed the door, and drove straight into him.
The 5 terrorists killed their injured comrade and fled for the hills, pursued by soldiers from the checkpoint. Rather than be taken alive, they shot each other. They died believing they would be rewarded in paradise for slaughtering 58 foreign infidels. The US State Department would later claim that the massacre was the work of a faction of Islamic Jihad called the Vanguard of Conquests, operating on the direct orders of Ayman Zawahiri. For his role in the atrocities committed by al-Jihad, Zawahiri was sentenced in absentia to death. But he was already looking towards new horizons.
He managed to change the thinking of al-Jihad from targeting the regime inside Egypt to new targets outside Egypt, because the killing of an American would grant more media coverage. That's why in 1998 the 2 leaders, Dr. Ayman Zawahiri of al-Jihad and Osama bin Laden of al-Qaeda, decided to establish the International Front for the Jihad against the Crusaders and Jews.
The jihad began with simultaneous strikes on American embassies in Kenya and Tanzania in August 1998, and a suicide mission against the American warship, USS Cole. 364 people were killed in these actions. But bin Laden and Zawahiri were moving inexorably towards a direct attack against their hated enemy. The image of the Dome of the Rock stands over the entrance of the Ain al-Hilweh refugee camp in southern Lebanon. Ain al-Hilweh is one of many al-Qaeda strongholds in the Middle East. From this camp, Islamic militant groups plot religious war against the West.
I think the West has lost his spirit. They have synced in the materialism, and for this they suffering from many social and moral problems.
To escape poverty and to give meaning to their lives, young men all over the Arab world have rallied to the standard of Islam to declare jihad against the West. They are inspired by the overthrow of Western-style secular regimes in countries like Iran, whose dramatic Islamic revolution of 1979 prompted the rise of militant groups in the Middle East, like Hezbollah.
أن تعطي المستضعفين ولا سيما
The Iranian Revolution gave oppressed people, in particular Muslims who live under international oppression, a glimpse of the possibilities of Islam.
أنها أوجدت أكثر من نقطة ضوء أن من الممكن.
It showed them that it was possible for this Western oppression, which monopolizes their economy, their politics and their security, to be swept away when people united in their faith stand together to confront arrogance.
In recent years, the militant group Hamas has also combined God and the gun to intoxicating effect in its war with Israel.
The major factor who push Muslims to return to their faith is the feeling of defeat.
The popularity of these groups is due not only to their defiance of the West, but also to their social programs, the schools and hospitals they provide to their communities, in addition to their intensive religious instruction.
The Islamic faith is perceived as a complete and comprehensive package by all sections of the community throughout the Islamic states and Arab nations. The unjust and repetitive attacks by the West, and especially the US, against the Muslim and Arab region stirs the feelings of anger and hatred. All those who have lost hope in their desperate attempts to improve their social and economic conditions, and those who have failed to achieve their political goals, especially in Palestine, have all found fulfillment in the adoption of the new Islamic ideas. First, because it guarantees them direct access to paradise through their reconciliation with Allah. Second, they firmly believe that only through the teachings of jihad will they secure their objectives.
Much of the Arab world has come to be dominated by one way of thinking, an anti-Western worldview directed first and foremost at the Western infiltrators in the Middle East.
أعداء الأمة الإسلامية هم اليهود قاتلهم الله سبحانه وتعالى ولن يردعهم إلا لون الدم في شعبهم القذر. بعد سنوات عديدة إن شاء الله سنتذكر أننا سندخل القدس فاتحين.
They would like to first cleanse the Arab lands from infidel regimes, and then, of course, cleanse the Middle East from Western presence. Of course, the most obvious Western presence is Israel. But ultimately, their target is not Ashkelon or Tel Aviv for all of these militant Islamic groups. Their target is the West, and specifically the Great Satan. The Great Satan is the United States. We're only a small state.
New York has lost one of its most famous landmarks, a symbol of all that is great in America. The Dome of the Rock still stands proud over Jerusalem. Until the war between Jew and Muslim over this place is resolved, there can be no resolution to the religious terror beyond.